What up, YouTube? Yeah, I don't know where that came from, sorry. Anyway, you might have noticed I still have my jacket on. It's still January, so it's still cold. But I didn't come here to give you a weather report. I came here to talk about learning. The last time I talked about what to learn. But today I'd like to talk about some different ways to learn and how they might be helpful to you. Again, this is a really big topic, but I'm going to keep it really simple. I'm going to talk about three different ways of learning that I think are especially useful for languages. The first one is rote learning. Rote learning is nothing to get excited about. It's pretty boring. I don't know if you remember doing those drills in the school with like the multiplication tables or writing that letter a over and over again. That's rote learning. Rote learning is basically just practice to make perfect. Number two. I think I'm going to stop that voice, sorry. Anyway, number two is observational learning. So this is learning by watching. When you think of like how kids kind of imitate their parents or teachers and things like that, you're talking about observational learning. And number three, in my normal voice, is cognitive learning. For those who don't know, cognition basically is a fancy word for thinking. So it's learning by thinking about something. Okay, just to make it clear, there are tons and tons more ways of learning that I'm not talking about, but I just want to focus on these three for the purpose of this video. Okay, let's start with rote learning a little bit more. Rote learning does get kind of a bad rap nowadays. It's not very creative, it's definitely not very exciting, but it is extremely important. Now, you don't want to learn everything through rote. You can't memorize everything there is related to language, but there are certain things for which it is especially useful. One of those things is, especially as a beginner, you don't really have that much knowledge about language in your head, so you need to build those foundations. And just like tennis, which I used as an analogy in the last video, in order to get those things ingrained, you've got to just practice them over and over again. Okay, second, there are a lot of cases where you really want to understand why you're supposed to say certain things, but there are other cases where it doesn't really matter. Think about, for example, when you learn your times tables, like 2 times 2 equals 4, 2 times 3 equals 6. If somebody asks you, well, why? Why does 2 times 2 equals 4? I don't know, maybe if you're some nerdy philosopher, that's a really interesting question, but for most practical purposes, it doesn't really matter why. It just does. 2 times 2 just equals 4. So when it comes to language learning, when does this apply? Well, this applies for things like if you want to know how to say this in another language, or you want to know how to call this thing, or the names of objects and stuff like that. It also applies when you need to conjugate verbs. So you know how when you talk about the future, you say I will go, but when you talk about the past, you say I went. That's called a verb conjugation. Why do we change it like that? Who cares? It just makes it easier for people to understand you if you do it properly. So basically, if you want to get those fundamentals down pat, rote learning or drills, repetition, is the way to go. This doesn't mean that rote learning is passive. It's not something you just shut your mind off and do. Go, went, will go, etc. You should be concentrating and active when you're doing it. Okay, so how can you do that? Well, for example, if you're looking at flashcards, rather than just kind of looking and putting it away, instead look at it and try to pronounce it or even make a sentence with it. Also, you can use your imagination to put yourself in places when you would use those words. The key to rote learning is to make it meaningful for you. So if it's just something that happened to be in the book or the course that you're taking, you're probably not going to remember it because you're just not going to care. But if it has some meaningful application to you, you're more likely to get something out of that. So observational learning is an interesting one. This is what you're doing essentially when you're watching a movie or even listening to music in a foreign language. You're observing the way native speakers are actually using the language. And this is great because they provide a model of how and when to use certain language. But observational learning is also often mistaken for passive learning. I cannot tell you how many students have told me they put on music in the background while they're focusing on something else. Or they're watching a movie, but they've got subtitles in their own language, so they're not really even paying attention to the movie. That's not observational learning. Observational learning also needs to be active. So you're not just sitting there with your eyes glazed, watching the movie, drinking beer and eating popcorn or whatever you do. Or if you've got music playing in the background, you're not cleaning at the same time. You're thinking about it. You're looking, you're taking notes, you're practicing yourself. That's observational learning. So in other words, observational learning is fantastic when it's used in conjunction with cognitive learning, which, if you don't remember, is thinking about what you're learning. So how does cognitive learning apply to learning a foreign language? Well, when you're thinking, you should be asking yourself questions about the stuff you're learning. For instance, you might think, well, why did the speaker use this particular word rather than another one? Or if there's something you want to say, how would a native speaker say that? Or if there's a difficult vocabulary where you don't know how to say, what's another way I could express the same idea? Or if you are engaged in some practice, maybe you've got a teacher or you're lucky enough to communicate with a native speaker, you make a mistake. Cognitive learning comes in when you think, well, why did I make that mistake? What's the correct way to say that? What's the difference between my mistake and the correct way to say that? That's cognitive learning. And if you apply this cognitive learning to your language studies, you're just going to get so much better so fast. Cool. So to sum up really quick, rote learning is great when you need to get some basic fundamental stuff that you don't need to think about too much. You just need to know. Observational learning is a great way to see native speakers using their language, but it's got to be active. You got to be taking notes and practicing either at the same time or after. It's also great in conjunction with cognitive learning, which you want to apply when you need to understand the word or phrase or whatever it is you're learning more deeply. Awesome, guys. Once again, thanks for checking out this video. And as usual, if you have any questions or comments, shoot me a message or write in the comment box below. I hope to see you next week.